Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week is Mitchel Chargo, partner with Hinshaw and Culbertson. Thank you very much for joining me today, Mitchel.
Thank you for having me, David. It's great to be here.
Before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Mitch, I always like to start with a little bit of background. I'm always interested in how people arrived in the cannabis industry. So what was it that brought you here today?
I'm sorry, I didn't. What?
Yeah. What was it that brought you to the cannabis industry today?
Well, that is a great question. It actually was a personal tragedy that brought me here. I've been practicing for 31 years currently. But back in 2019, I lost my father in a traumatic way. And it was really a wake-up call for me in a number of different ways that impacted me professionally, personally. And I was presented with an opportunity to leave private practice and join a medical cannabis manufacturing company here in Minnesota. And I looked at this opportunity as a chance to try to shake up my life a little bit. When you lose someone to you, it's not necessarily that life is too short, but it's more about maybe it's a great opportunity to try to shake things up and change a little bit, see what else you can do, what can you accomplish, what can you learn. We're always learning, we're always growing. And I looked at this opportunity, which was really out of left field. I wasn't looking for a position. I was a partner in a mid-size law firm here in commercial real estate and business law. And this opportunity came up. And what sold me on the opportunity was a tour of the grow facility, which I'd never seen anything like that before in my life, right? I mean, I didn't know anything about cannabis other than what I smoked as a kid. So for me, this was a great opportunity to shake things up in my life and to really dive into a practice area which has limited engagement involvement here in Minnesota and really understand and learn regulatory affairs on a different level. Compliance is just it's a fascinating subject. It's a fascinating area to practice in. And I just dove in and I took it. And I haven't looked back.
I mean, you're definitely right. When you have that loss, when you sustain a loss like that, it changes your perspective on all things, and I'm very sorry to hear about the loss of your father.
Thank you.
Was it something specific about that tragedy that made cannabis an option, or was it just that it kind of came up by chance and you looked into a new direction?
It was the latter. It came up by chance, and I think when you look at these opportunities that come out of left field, and we can have a much longer discussion another time about whether is it really chance or is it really, destiny, whatever that is. I don't know. I looked at it and I said, this is a great opportunity for me to step outside of something that I've been doing comfortably for 26, 25 years and test myself and see what I got, right? And dive in and see what you can learn and see what you can make of it. And at the same time, figure out what is this medical marijuana all about and how is it helping people and changing people's lives. And it was a great opportunity for me to shake it up a little bit. And I think that it took the trauma, sadly, to do that. But sometimes that's what you need, is a slap upside the head with some trauma to say there are some other things out there in the world that you ought to try and not be afraid of. So that's what I did.
Well, and I think part of that fear is the difficulty, right? You're 25 years into your career. You kind of already know all the cheat codes and how to do your best possible job. But so
Right.
when you decide to make that move, was it a difficult transition? What was the learning curve like?
It was I mean it's a massive learning curve, but I think attorneys are usually well trained for how to handle a shift or a change in the landscape, right? We have to. Laws change, we have to adapt. Clients change, we have to adapt to the changing client and their changing needs. So this was just more of I had to adapt myself into getting uncomfortable, or let me say it differently, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable with some things that was news topical subject matter for me. But I was surrounded by fantastic management team, and you learn along the way. And there was really, I stepped in, and not only did I have to learn about cannabis, but I had to learn about how to handle a pandemic. I had to learn about how to handle a team of really dedicated and passionate employees of a company that, once you take a passion for marijuana, you take a pandemic and the chaos, and you have people that comes with that, and then you have a patient population that's caught kind of in the middle. You have to pivot. You have to pivot. You have to dig in, roll up your sleeves, and you have to figure this out, which is what I did.
What was the company that you went to work for?
It was Leafline Industries.
Okay. And why, what were they looking for in filling that role?
Well, it was the first time they had a general counsel. And I think what they were looking for was a way to have boots on the ground, an embedded lawyer that could really help navigate from within. And, cannabis business, other than the compliance regulatory affairs and the illegal nature federally of the product that you're dealing with, it's a business like anything else. It needs counsel, it needs guidance on, you know, commercial agreements, their property management, real estate affairs, uh, board governance, corporate work, employment work, right? Labor work. It has all the same core needs that any other business has, but then you tie together the unique nature of the product that it's manufacturing, and it just requires a little bit more of a niche application of the law.
Did you have a bit of a warming up period to kind of get used to things, or was it feet to the fire right out of the gate?
Oh, it was feet to the fire right out of the gate. And I'll tell you what, I don't think that's changed. I think cannabis in and of itself, I had jet black hair before I started. And I think cannabis years are what? I'm sure you've heard this multiple times. There's always a varying degree that like one normal year is like seven cannabis years or whatever. And it ages really quickly because it's so rapid firing and there are constantly fire drills, right? Chaos all the time, which I like. I mean, I think that comes with the territory of, you know, cannabis is a lot about navigating in the gray, right? And what the general counsel role really instilled in me was a, a way to learn how to counsel a client from within, navigating gray areas where on the outside, in private practice, lawyers tend to be very black and white. The law says this is what we do. The answer is either yes or the answer is either no. And on the inside, when you're general counsel, you don't always have the luxury of saying no, right? You have all kinds of pressures from management teams. Yeah, the board, everybody wants to try to row the boat in the same direction. And perhaps we can't get there doing it this way, but we have to try doing it a different way. And that's getting into those gray areas, which sometimes can be uncomfortable. And we just have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And it can be challenging for many lawyers.
Well, and you're also dealing with a host of different personalities. And
Oh,
I have to imagine that's difficult to navigate as well.
yes. Yes. And you have scientists, you have the growers and the cultivators, and then you have in the medical world, you have the patient facing pharmacists. In Minnesota, pharmacists were actually actively engaged. You have the patient-facing, technicians, and now in the adult rec world, all of that seems to coalesce around your customer-facing bud tenders, and every one of them has a different personality. Every one of them has a very different knowledge base, and I try to learn from them as much as I can from the non-law side of things because it really helps me practice law.
I understand that given the nature of your profession, there's a great deal of confidentiality, but can you think of any examples or situations when you were that in-house counsel where you helped solve a particular issue or a problem that the company was trying to navigate?
Yeah, I mean, banking is clearly one of the issues. Um, One of the issues that all cannabis companies face. Now, I was fortunate we had a banking relationship in place before I got there. But navigating the banking relationship, the ability to have in place the kind of financing and funding that you need to keep your operations alive and running beyond just cash flowing off sales was really an intricate and delicate subject, right? We have a bank that's willing to extend credit, take deposits, at some point in time, facilitate, cash transportation, logistics, and blend all of that together. And then you add on top of that the next layer of, well, what about the real estate relationships that you have with your dispensaries, right? And the delicate relationship between landlords and us as tenants, right, in those spaces. Um, Keeping those relationships um, always working well was very important, and can be stressful at times. And when you take it one level further, we had a mandate to open additional dispensaries from the legislature. And then you're trying to tackle the problem of then cities not wanting cannabis in their jurisdiction, right? Which was always a problem. And the stress of trying to get locations, like any other business on a retail side, you want to have a dispensary that's got high visibility, easy access, right? Safe location for employees. And you're knocking on doors all over trying to get into these cities and being rebuffed at every at every opportunity until you find the right one. So marrying all of these tactical and yet operational and strategic issues into one smoothly functioning business was always a challenge. But maintaining the ability to operate always seemed to work out.
Were you accepted by your coworkers or peers at the company, or were you seen as the law or the legal side of the industry?
Oh, I think both. Like anything else, you come into a new environment and people are welcoming, but they're also like, he's the lawyer, right? And I'm sure there were times when I was like the last to know. Like lawyers are always the last to know, right? I didn't, even the clients that you have in private practice sometimes don't want to come to you and tell you what they're dealing with because it's like, I know what he's going to say, right? And,
Yeah.
and so I think it was both. And I think by the end, my goal was never to act like the lawyer. My goal was to be part of the team. And I'm just a cog in the machine that helps navigate, you know, hopefully preempting crises, and then crises happen. So you have someone that's trained to deal with the crises, right? And I just wanted to fit in and be part of a team. That's not always easy as a lawyer.
In your opinion, should every cannabis operator have some form of general counsel?
That's a great question. Certainly when you reach a size of operations where economically speaking, it seems to make sense. You're paying outside counsel. Does it make sense to bring somebody in and have an embedded lawyer? Those kind of business decisions oftentimes are, revenue based. They're also operations based. The more heavy into compliance and regulatory affairs you are, companies have to make that decision. Do we just want to have dedicated teams for compliance, which I say, of course, every cannabis operator needs to have a dedicated compliance staff or personnel. Um, but I think it's really a operational and revenue based decision, and they certainly can help. But not every not every cannabis operator is going to need to have that lawyer embedded. They can have a great relationship with an outside counsel who acts like general counsel, right? And that's sufficient as well.
Okay. I was reading up a little bit about your role with the International Cannabis Bar Association. I'm unfamiliar with the association. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that the association does?
They're a great resource for providing information, legal updates, right? Lawyers tend to be parts of these associations because we all want to stay as much up to date on affairs and law changes and what's happening in other states and even what's happening in other countries, because sometimes those other countries or other states are the bellwether for what's going to happen in this country or in certain states in the country. So they do a great job of providing seminars and updates, networking event. It's always great to get to know other lawyers in the space. They're in Minnesota is kind of unique. There aren't a lot of lawyers that have true like marijuana, cannabis experience. And that's going to change here in the next, couple of years as our market emerges. But it's always great to network and find other peers and colleagues and get their take on affairs and their take on the law, how they're handling things. And INCBA it's a great resource for that.
I mean, if they're working on regulatory changes, I can't imagine a busier association than INCBA.
Yeah, it's busy. I mean, there are lots. I mean, there are even the American Bar Association, other associations now are starting to kick up the dust a little bit on cannabis because it's now, even with the outcome of the current election, right? I don't think, or at one point in time, I might have thought party affiliation would, either have an accelerant effect or, slowing down effect. I don't know that that's going to be the case anymore. So now I think the message is becoming clear. If you're not going to get in the game, you're going to get left behind.
Is the association only for law professionals, or do they put out information where cannabis stakeholders, would have access to it to see where some of these changes are coming?
I think that's a great question. I understood because it's a bar association, um, it's for lawyers.
Yeah.
But it could be also for non-legal paraprofessionals. I don't know whether that's true or not. Like paralegals or legal assistants who are affiliated or employed by a law firm or in-house. Um, it's a great question. I think you'd have to go out to their website and find out.
Okay. In your opinion, how would you describe the cannabis industry in Minnesota today?
Um, that is an amazing question. It is I I think this program has the potential to be great. I think this program is still trying to get its footing, its foundation. They being the Office of Cannabis Management, I know received an enormous number of license pre-approval applications. And, I tend to cut the OCM a little bit of slack because the legislature here pushed really hard to get this program moving really fast and with time frames and time deadlines that I'm not so sure worked in the best interests of the OCM. I think they're doing the best they can with what they have. They're trying to staff up. At the same time, they're taking in, nearly a couple thousand of just license pre-approval applications, right? So that side of it, um, I think the infrastructure, once it gets set up and rolling, um, will get off the ground. I think they're a little bit behind. I think they are not where they want to be in either license pre-approval application reviews and or drafting and concluding the rules that are going to supplement the statute that really are the guide for all the operators. Those aren't expected to be complete, I think, until sometime mid to late first quarter of 25. So the status of affairs right now is it's still kind of on hold until they get through this first set of license pre-approval applications, and there's going to be a lottery. And for me, I think the only disappointment that I have in the system is the lottery itself. I tend to think, and I may be an outlier on this, but I would have liked to have seen a system which, if your American dream is to have a cannabis business, as long as you qualify or you don't have disqualifying factors or events, you get a license, right? Assuming that there's, perhaps whether license caps are put into place or not, I'm not even sure I'm in favor of those. I don't know that there's been a great answer to this question, but I would have liked to have seen an open market and let the market shake itself out, which, it's had its ups and its downs in approaches like that too. So I don't know if that would have been the answer. I would have liked to have seen it done that way because I think, throwing anything to chance and luck in a lottery, people who have spent a lot of money getting to that point isn't necessarily fair either. That's on the state side. There's some fascinating things happening here on the tribal side. And, I'm heavily involved in the tribal cannabis arena, and I think that there's going to be some astonishing developments in the tribal cannabis side, and all within, the territorial limitations of Minnesota. So I think there are going to be good things to come for this program.
Well, what are these astonishing things going to be?
Well, you have 11 federally recognized tribes in the state that are currently, in negotiations with the governor to compact for cannabis activity off their tribally regulated or outside of their tribally regulated lands. So, as you know, the bands or the tribes, they're sovereigns, right? They're sovereigns just like the states are sovereign. So, they're since they're both sovereign, neither is subordinate to the other. The tribes have a unique ability, if they choose, to exercise their sovereignty to establish legalized cannabis within their tribally regulated lands. And they can go ahead and grow and sell on their tribally regulated lands, which would include their, recognized reservation territories, right? So they can start developing a cannabis program, which there are several tribes here now that have. And I do believe the state of Minnesota is going to be looking at these nations to supplement the supply of cannabis products into the Minnesota market, because when the state says ready, go, one of the chronic problems I think they're going to face, like many other markets did, is a shortage of supply, right? Yeah. But since the bands have been able to grow and have been growing and selling, and some have actively engaged dispensaries on their reservations already, there's going to be an ability to get product into the shelves of many of the first, operating dispensaries in the state, which I think will be a big boon to the state's program.
Isn't that the equivalent of crossing state lines, though?
No,
I
don't think so. I mean, unless what you're talking about is coming off the reservation into the state. So that's a great point, and I'm sorry I answered it so flippantly. The compacting process is underway to address that issue, right? So that, the state is going to enter into these agreements with each federally recognized nation here in Minnesota to allow for cannabis operations outside of their tribally regulated lands, which will then, and there'll be rules to the game and how you interplay and how you work together. But it's one of the very unique relationships so far between the state sovereign and the Native American sovereigns. And um, I think it's going to create some fantastic opportunities for sure for the tribes, right? And, some of those opportunities will, the way I look at it, there are at least uh, five amazing benefits that these nations are going to have. I mean, revenue generation is one, right? And you look at the comparable activities such as gaming and the casino revenue that flows. I mean, we know, right? The tribal nations tend to be economically disadvantaged, and that these forms of revenue really are can be a boon to their economic development. So you have a revenue generation component, you'll have a job creation component. Each one of these cultivating facilities and dispensaries and manufacturing operations create jobs on tribally regulated land, which is um, important not only for income, but skill development and training, and it's transferable, right? So if members of the band want to leave the tribally regulated lands and go stateside and work in this industry, then they now have the skills and the training to do it, which is great. This cannabis within the reservation helps develop critical infrastructure for the tribes as well. So they're able to use that revenue and deploy it for better housing, better roads, um, community facilities. So that's another great opportunity. Entrepreneurial opportunities. So you don't necessarily have to be in the cannabis business or as a cannabis operator, and that's a whole different technical discussion as well. But getting into the ancillary businesses that feed the cannabis industry or work hand in hand with the cannabis industry, other avenues for the band members. And then last, I think, community health and wellness, the economic development through cannabis really allows the bands to invest in community health and wellness programs. And many of the band members, including the elders, look at cannabis as a great alternate to pharmaceuticals. And so all of this translates into a lot of upside for the nations, and in the state of Minnesota, for sure, it's going to be a unique program. There are a handful of other states that have gone the compacting route as well. And I think it's working out in those states and for those bands as well.
Do you know how many vertically integrated operators there are currently on tribal land?
I don't, but I would imagine um, the vertical integration is not necessarily prohibited in the tribal cannabis arena the way it is in Minnesota, right? Minnesota is expressed, I'm sure you've heard, you prohibited in Minnesota except for a meso business and a micro business, really in the medical business combination license. But beyond that, you can't have vertical integration. And where I think that hands an advantage to the tribal cannabis operators is they can be, which can streamline operations and efficiencies. And really, equally as important to me, they can weave their branding narrative seamlessly through their, you know, production supply, which is a big deal.
You know, it's a really good point. Every state seems to have the standard regulations, and then every once in a while you get a head scratcher. Why no vertical integration in Minnesota?
I understood the rationale was to try and keep the multi-state operators out. Minnesota is even with the very first drafts of our cannabis legislation, I think the goal in the legislature's mind was craft beer industry model, right? Minnesota has a really uh, strong performing craft beer industry, and I think the state's legislature here looked at this as a chance to really foster more of the small business mentality, uh, with cannabis and maybe get better products, better a more closely knit market, and you won't have these large multi-state operators coming from out of state dominating the market.
Is that a rule that you think sticks?
Well, for now, I think
Yeah.
they're so heavily invested in it now that I don't know how you undo it unless they loosen some of the standards down the road between your license classes, right? Because each license class here comes with the restriction on if you own this license class, you can't then own these over here.
So what is that threshold for vertical integration on that? Is it the meso tier? Do you know what the size constraints are?
Yeah, I mean, you for a meso license here, you get up to 15,000 canopy feet of plant. You get up to three retail locations you can manufacture, right? And your manufacturing and your cultivation do not need to be in the same physical location, nor do your retail locations. And, it's transporting product back and forth. I mean, it, it's an interesting, whether 15,000 square feet or canopy feet of plant is enough or is profitable. I think what the state was trying to do here is math, right? I think they're trying to mathematically figure out supply, demand, price per pound, which is, way beyond, over my head. Let somebody else figure that out, right? Um, and then the cannabis micro business is up to 5,000 canopy feet for plants, one retail location, and you can manufacture. And some may choose to do bits and pieces of, I want to cultivate, but I don't want to manufacture. That's fine too, right? So you get to do it all, but it's only in those two license classes do you get that vertically integrated structure.
Going back to tribal lands, when it comes to staffing, do those operations need to be staffed by tribal members or can they be staffed by anyone?
That's a great question. And oftentimes comes down to tribal government policy, right? And I think what the bands have done a really good job addressing is the gap perhaps in the current skill sets of you know, cultivators and manufacturers, and perhaps even bud tenders, right? Where they're realizing we may need to go bring in talent from outside of the band, and have that talent teach, train, educate, lead the way, and then, have more of a pipeline for tribal members to step in and take over, which again, I think is fantastic opportunity for skill set development and longer term longevity of the program.
So, being based in Wisconsin myself, is there any opportunity for tribe to tribe commerce from Minnesota to Wisconsin?
Another great question, and I know that nationally, many of the tribal-based organizations are trying to address tribe to tribe commerce, ignoring the boundaries, right, of state territorial lines. For now, my interpretation, it's a conservative one. My interpretation is it you can't do it. It's, state law technically, most states don't allow it, and federally, obviously, you can't do it, right? And I'm always telling clients, you don't want to be the test case. Nobody ever wants to test that. Well, maybe some people do. But I never wanted to be the one that counseled someone that, go ahead and try it. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, and you're on the next edition of Cops, don't say I didn't tell you so. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. We're making history. It's like, yeah, but it's not always good history. No.
Right. Or it's not always one that comes with your personal freedom. So you gotta be careful about that, right?
Right. Um, When you were talking about working internally for operators, you had mentioned compliance. What are some of the best practices that stakeholders can do in order to make sure that they remain compliant with changing regulations?
Oh, well, you've got great questions.
Thanks.
So that's a great question, and it's one that for me is all about compliance starts as an approach, right? So my approach when I'm counseling clients on compliance is really compliance to me is a cultural mindset, right? So you have to come into this knowing that for compliance efforts to be successful, everyone in the organization, from the CEO to management to the board, cultivators to bud tenders, they all have to buy in and embody a compliant culture. And, you know, so to me, compliance efforts have to be ingrained in the operations community, its culture, and why? Because it touches on everything. It touches on record keeping, security, packaging, labeling, testing, advertising, transporting, delivery, quality assurance. All of those issues are really compliance oriented. And so, so for me, I look at this and I say, you got to have this mindset. And then, there are really, oh, six basic elements, maybe, of how you look at a compliance program. And the most important reason is your number one asset for any cannabis operation is your license, right? And how do you keep your license? Well, you keep your license by being compliant and doing things the right way. So when you have internal controls, right, which deal with how you operate on a daily basis, your written policies, your plans, your SOPs, all of these documents inform and navigate your daily operations, your training, and assigning responsibility for performance of normal job duties, right? So you gotta have that, and with that internal control and established leadership team, that's compliance leadership team, and that could be a team, it could be a single officer until you get going. I look at internal risk mitigation. That's another one, right? So that making sure that your policies and your SOPs are all consistent with state law, and that you're implementing them in a way so that they actually get carried out. And one of the biggest things I think I tried to instill as general counsel, I'm always trying to counsel clients to make sure that if you have cannabis buy-in throughout your company, compliance buy-in throughout your company, I'm sorry, transparent communication is a big deal. And that goes back to the very first question you asked me. Well, were you accepted? Were you not accepted as general counsel? And sometimes it's like the lawyer is always the last to know because people don't want to tell the lawyer, right, what's going on for fear of, oh my God. But a compliance program, for it to be successful, has to facilitate open and transparent communication. So your best practices for compliance not only have to have the internal controls and the risk mitigation, but transparent communication. And then, of course, the fourth factor for me is training, right? You got to be able to have an effective compliance training program. And then with that, your ongoing active and assessive risk mitigation and assessment protocols within. So you're constantly, not only you're training your people, but you're constantly testing your people through checks. So your internal compliance team is actually rolling inspections and audits throughout your operations to make sure that when the state ultimately comes knocking on your door, that you've already been there, done that, and you're ready to go and face any inspection. And I think the last one to me is always having your non-compliance response team and procedures in place, because there is going to come a day when you do have to face that audit or inspection. And there is always that likelihood that despite your best efforts, you're not compliant with something and the state's going to send you that, violation order, and now you got to respond and fix it. And in my way of doing business and handling compliance, I tend to look at the regulator as our business partner. And that may be That's just my way of, that's my style. They can be your adversary or they can be, you treat them like a partner. And I tend to think that you treat them like an adversary and everything is a fight. You run a risk sometimes of your cannabis client having their operations grind to a halt because you've now got this friction with your regulator, as opposed to more of a, you know, I want to say partner or collaborative approach where, you don't have to accept everything the regulator says as the written word, but you do have to accept that they are the authority and they are here to protect the program and protect the consumer, right? And our job is, if our brand and our narrative is saying we're putting out the best, safest, purest product, then let's live with that narrative and say, okay, we did something wrong, we got to fix it, and want to be known as a good player in the market, I think is really key. So that was a very long answer to your question. I'm sorry, but those are the 6 best practices in my mind for a successful compliance program.
No, I think that's extremely beneficial information. And I think you're lucky to have regulators that are willing to have that partnership, and kind of exploring the likelihood of that partnership is something that anyone should do. I mean, I have heard stories about some regulators thinking they should be more law enforcement
Right.
rather than rule,
Yeah.
So
Yep.
it's great that you were able to build and foster that relationship with them.
Yeah, and you know what it's going to be? It hasn't started here yet. I mean, the OCM is, running enforcement operations now for, players in the hemp derived space that are actually selling marijuana under the rug, they're in or selling product that's not compliant with the hemp derived or low potency specifications. But, they're still, I think, putting together their staff of inspectors and regulators, and it remains to be seen, how those relationships will go. My approach was and will remain, it will go better for everybody if we have a vision of a relationship that's more collaboratively based with our regulator. I mean, it's not their job to come in and tell us um, how our brand should be, how the client's narrative should run, how their product should look, taste, feel, but it is their job to uphold the standards that the legislature and the OCM have put out. And we know that clients should know that when they're taking a license. And no, we push back where we need to push back, but we push back respectfully. And internally, we ingrain that culture of we want to be best in class, right? So to do
Mhm.
that, it's always the consumer's interests in mind, and compliance is the way to get there.
For some people that have maybe taken a more adversarial role, what's a way that they can push back respectfully?
Well, tone always helps, right? I mean, this isn't necessarily a legal approach. It's more really about um your relationship with an adversary, right? I mean, and I don't necessarily mean adversary negatively. We have adversaries in courtrooms every day, right? The other lawyer is considered your adversary and their client is considered an adverse party. But, and the same thing when you're negotiating a purchase agreement for real estate. I'm an adverse part, an attorney to the attorney on the other side. So when we look at the concept of the regulators being the adverse party, we we can take that knowing, we have to counsel our clients and our clients have to take this embedded culture of compliance seriously in how they interact and engage with the regulator. So your tone, your attitude, your, respectfulness, your, they have a job to do, we have a job to do. And the reality is that there's always a way to get this done. And clean up problems. That's what we do. And it's your mindset and your attitude and the relationship with the other side that really dictates how this is going to work out for you. Now, that doesn't mean that they come in and they say you violated A, B, C, D, and E, that you have to roll over and say, you're right, I did. There should be avenues in every state framework that allows the aggrieved party to appeal, to have a reconsideration, workout or something so that we have the right to be heard. Um, and it's how you handle that, I think that goes a long way for distinguishing one brand from another. And again, it goes, do you want to be known as the good player in the market or not? And you think about it, if you remember 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when you're growing up and it's you know the people in the cannabis legacy market, was more about being a rebel. It was more about sticking it to the man, right? And don't you're not taking this from me. And but it's legal now. So it's like I think that mindset of like sticking it to the government, it, especially in states where it's legal, you don't need it anymore. Now you've got it, and what are you going to do with it? And how are you going to shape your culture to make the most out of that opportunity for your business and for the consumer?
While you were working as general counsel for the medical cannabis manufacturers, did regulators ever come knocking?
All the time.
Oh yeah.
I mean, all the time. And we um and again, there were instances of how we deal with those inspections, and we always wanted to try to have somebody present. We always did have somebody present. But we try to um, engage with the regulator positively and learn from every experience that every single time that regulator stepped foot or made a document demand, you know, how did we do? What could we have done better? What did we learn from this experience? And yet we're not giving away the house, right? And for anybody who's listening to this podcast, this is not Mitch being a pushover. Mitch is not a pushover. I'm always thinking about client's best interest and how to get the client from point A to point B without the client missing a beat, spending more money than they have to spend, and bringing their business to a halt for a reason that could have been avoided, right?
Mhm.
So I'm sorry. I just think I talked in third person. I never do that. That's
It's all right. It's all right. No, it plays. It plays. Um, so one thing for cannabis lawyers is that it's been kind of trial by fire. Do you know, is cannabis law being taught in law school right now? I mean, is there a crop
I
of
think
cannabis
so.
lawyers coming up? Yeah.
I think there are certain law schools that now have it in their curriculum. It's probably like anything else, an elective course. Um, and I couldn't identify which law schools in the country are doing it, but I have heard, I actually think both the well, there are three law schools here. I think each one of them has an elective course on cannabis law. And clearly, our continuing legal education organization is putting out courses to teach lawyers about cannabis law, which I think is vital and important.
Well, you made the switch because of a life-changing event.
Mhm.
Looking at it, are you happy with the change that you made?
I am actually, there isn't about a day that goes by that I don't thank God that I made that switch. I mean, not every day is a every day brings some new challenge and every day brings some interesting issue to light. But I've been able to seamlessly weave together seemingly unrelated practice areas into cannabis, right? So I speak a lot about the intersection between commercial real estate and cannabis, which there are some very nuanced and niche issues that landlords and tenants and buyers of real estate intended for use in the cannabis market need to consider. And fortunately, I've been blessed to have had a very long career in commercial real estate. So the traditional issues are still the traditional issues in a cannabis operator's lease. But now you weave into these other experiential issues of dealing in the cannabis market and a cannabis operator like I have, knowing that these leases also require intricate modification to work for the tenant. So there's not a day that goes by that I'm not glad that I made that change. There's not a day that goes by that I'm not like I'm having fun as a lawyer, which I can't say I had fun for the first 25 years of my career. I don't know too many lawyers that say, "Oh my God, I love my job." But I'm sure they're out there. But I really am enjoying this now, and I love meeting the people in the space. It's just it's fantastic.
Well, I understand we're running out of time, but given your expertise, I did want to ask, what are some of those things that operators should consider when it comes to real estate?
You have to really understand, and this is going to sound backwards. I always take this approach when I'm dealing with, especially if I'm representing the operator. Before we even get into the document itself, say for instance a lease for a dispensary, I want to know more about the landlord situation um, as part of our pre-lease negotiation strategy. So it's understanding and making sure the landlord and the owner of the building understands why I'm asking these questions. What is your relationship with your bank? Do you have a mortgage that's been recorded against the property in a loan agreement? Because your lender is going to, your loan documents are going to govern whether or not you really can lease this space to my clients. And before we spend a lot of time and money, let's make sure your lawyer and your broker and you have all familiarized yourself with your loan documents and any other leases you might have with other tenants that may preclude or preempt the vice industry, so to speak, from being in the same retail location as a big box, tenant. And they do have those, right? So it's making sure that you understand the perspectives of the landlord owner before we even get started, and also understanding the practical realities on the ground for the client and the tenant. Um, will save a lot of time and aggravation for everybody involved, and approaching it that way. And then, of course, there's a whole different set of analyses that go into the modifications that are needed for a lease, and really making sure that I'm helping the landlord and the landlord's counsel understand some of the things that we're asking for aren't necessarily because I'm being overzealous for the tenant. It's state law is going to require A, B, C, D, and E. And even though our rules aren't done yet, I have a very good insight as to what they're going to require for compliance. And so some of the traditional norms that a landlord might be expecting are going to be tweaked a little bit, and they have to be comfortable with that. And essentially, the message I'm giving is you're about to enter into a very unique relationship with a very unique cannabis business and a unique industry. So don't expect the traditional norms in a lease to be the way this is going to go. There's going to be some twists and turns for you. And I try to get that out in front before we spend a lot of time.
Are those traditional norms, are we just talking legal language that are in the documentation or operational stuff, like how you're getting paid?
It could be both, right? I mean, it's, boy, if you ask a landlord, by the way, if you get paid in cash, any issues with that, right? Because most leases don't give a cash option for payment for your rent. And, that sends landlords oftentimes into a tailspin, like, I don't want to take cash, right? And I don't, and, so you have, the traditional norms in a lease when we're talking about what most non-lawyers will call the boilerplate. Um, it changes, right? You just take a very simple provision like landlord access, right? Where, landlords will have that mindset. Well, I'm the owner. It's my building. I should be able to access any place I want in this building. And being able to say, you're right, you're the owner, and you should be able to go in anytime to the cannabis operator space you want. However, it just doesn't work that way, right? Because the state also has an interest, right, in making sure that diversion, theft of product, all of that is prevented. And so we have security precautions, security requirements, visitor policies, all of these things from a compliance perspective that need to be followed. And unfortunately, landlord, you're no different. You have to comply, right? There's always compromise and ways to work this through with the landlord, but getting that traditional mindset adjusted a little bit takes a little effort and understanding the issues.
When did you move on from general in-house counsel?
Uh, towards the end of 2022.
Okay.
Right.
Any reason in particular you made the switch or a new opportunity?
Our company was acquired,
Oh,
and that ended up, opening doors elsewhere after the acquisition. So, and I became a partner at Hinshaw and Culbertson, and now I'm, co-chair of the firm's national cannabis practice, and it worked out the way it was supposed to work out.
well, Mitch, I really do appreciate you taking the time today. Before we get out of here, is there anything else that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience either knows about yourself or your work with Hinshaw and Culbertson?
Sure. Again, we're a full service firm, and I spent a lot of my time not only dealing with commercial real estate issues, the intersection of commercial real estate and cannabis and compliance, but also work with vendors and manufacturers. And I spent a lot of time dealing with their, sales agreements and navigating the issues that come with that, and enjoy that equally. So, that's about it. This is a great forum, and I've been out looking at your work, and the CEN does great work.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we need to have possibly a follow-up episode on what some of the things that are facing the equipment manufacturers.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in doing that when you've got time, and I'd come back anytime.
Well, Mitch, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you too, David. I appreciate your time.
Before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You could also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. All right, for Mitchel Chargo, partner with Hinshaw and Culbertson, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we will see you next week.
Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.